It has been much longer than I would like it to have been since I've been in China. My hope is to go back sometime in the next year or two. But when I was there, it was 2010, 2011. And the most common thing that members of the party and members of the private sector said to me was that China was not going to be stable beneath something like 8% growth. The way they described China to me was almost as a transaction between the party and the public. And the public support for the party was dependent on this roaring growth rate. And then I watched over time as that growth rate began to fall. And then under Xi, as the growth rate began to be deprioritized, as he began to do things that were clearly about control, ideology, and we're sacrificing that level of prosperity. And I've wondered how much has been a turn from this growth above all to nationalism as the new way you hold the country together. I mean, everybody seemed obsessed to me with the question of how do you hold together a country as big as China? How do you keep it, to the point she made about when China's great, how do you keep it unified? Is that accurate? I've always found this puzzling because it seemed to happen very fast, right? This thing everybody was talking about to, well, we're just going to experiment with actually letting the economy be much weaker than that, and doing so fairly successfully.
I think Xi's response to the dilemma of national control is at 2 or 3 levels. One, his first impulse is always ideological. Remember the analogy with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. We just need to get these kids to read more Xi Jinping thought, and that'll brighten up their day. In my view, not an enormous recipe for success, but that's his first impulse. Double down on ideology and double down on ideological propaganda. And there's the whole view that they can produce a whole new generation of what they call little pinks, that is little reds, 小粉红, who will capture this vision and transcend them into the future. The second response to the challenges of national control, political control during a period of sliding growth, is simply the surveillance state. The so-called white card movement was a protest movement where people didn't hold up protest signs, they just held up blank white cards. Well, those people were all tracked down through surveillance systems, their phone locations, etc., and whisked away. And so understand that the surveillance state, through iris recognition, gait recognition, facial recognition, the monitoring of all your payments, which are all done electronically, means that, frankly, the tools available to the surveillance state today is stuff that Mao and Stalin would have dreamed of way back when. So that's number 2. Number 3 goes to the core of the economic dilemma which the party faces at present. Effectively, through a series of central economic policy decisions, what Xi Jinping has said and what they are now doing is placing an absolute priority on, let's call it, the supply side of the economy rather than the private demand side of the economy as the growth vehicle. And the supply side of the economy is manufacturing, it's industry, it's high technology. It's ensuring that we have complete control over our own supply chains and that we progressively control the supply chains of the world. That's what we're doing, because against a future national security crisis over Taiwan, we will not allow our country to be vulnerable to external pressure. And that's what they're doing. That is therefore sacrificing the normal evolution of private domestic consumption as the driver of growth. And if you look at China's domestic savings rate, which remains high, the private domestic consumption rate, which remains low relative to where they would normally be as a low-middle income country, there is a direct trade-off here. So we are likely to see continued lower growth in pursuit of these national economic, industrial policy, national security objectives in the economy with this trade-off. But the problem is lower levels of employment, higher levels of youth unemployment, and people, frankly, becoming increasingly disenchanted.
I want to zoom in on youth protest movements like the white cards. You also have the sort of people just laying down, right? There's the sort of quiet quitting, so to speak.
Lying flat.
Lying flat. It's hard to know from the outside how meaningful things like this are, but typically when you begin to think about a society with sustained levels of youth unemployment, you imagine a certain ferment to that, a certain space of dissatisfaction. Now there's a lot of surveillance, right? A very, very powerful central party, but it's also a party that does have to respond at some level to, a public if it is disenchanted. So what is the theory of this? Does the Chinese Communist Party see this as a problem? Just see it as a discontent to be managed?
They see it as a problem, but in Xi Jinping's calculus, they see it as the lesser problem against the greater problem, which is national economic self-reliance and national economic dominance in the driving technologies of the future. What they call in the party's discourse the new productive forces, which is essentially AI, quantum, and everything else. If you want evidence of this, just look at China's Made in China 2025 strategy, which is the largest scale exercise in any nation's industrial policy seen in economic history. So what's their theory of the case? This massive investment in industry and in leading-edge technologies will ultimately produce a new wave of productivity in the economy, which will create a new wave of wealth, including in the related services sectors. But this will take a while to wash through. In the meantime, maintain surveillance and do a certain amount to keep the economy and growth as stable as possible. For example, the property sector has been the one in which most Chinese citizens have had their savings over the last 20 years. Over the last 5 years, the property market has collapsed through the floor through a series of policy and political interventions by Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, rather than allowing the property sector to collapse completely, decided as of about 2024 to put a floor under it, to rescue some of the property development firms, and also to ensure that people were not going to lose anything and everything. So there's an awareness that you can't just allow private consumption to be destroyed completely. You can't allow that. But has that dissipated his fundamental ideological resolve to build this all-powerful Chinese industrial state, which controls supply chains at home and abroad? Nah, hasn't compromised that one bit. The bottom line is Xi Jinping's response to a very disgruntled body politic was, what you need to do is to learn how to 吃苦, which is eat bitterness. That's what we've done throughout the most difficult periods of party history. Of course, if you've got a formidable, all-seeing, all-dancing surveillance system across the country run by the security and intelligence authorities, you can say 吃苦, eat bitterness, with some effect, because the system will be out there to round you up if you don't do so accordingly and with a smile on your face.
Well, let's talk about the way he's building that industrial juggernaut, because there was a way of looking at Xi Jinping's economic policy a few years ago, which made it seem like he was in many ways decapitating the productive factors of the Chinese economy. This is maybe a good place to talk about Jack Ma and Alibaba, which was, the Chinese national champion, globally competitive, until Ma was seen as getting too big for his britches. And then something happened. I mean, what happened to Jack Ma?
Well, Jack was always larger than life, and I've known Jack quite a lot over the years in one form or another. If you ever listen to Jack's English, you'll notice an Australian twang. It's not from me, but as a young person, he went off to Australia to learn some English. So we're responsible for Jack's version of the English language. But the bottom line is this. Jack became adulated across China as the symbol of this new entrepreneurial class. That is, this poor boy from nowhere could build up this extraordinary firm to become world leading. But in the party's view, and in Xi Jinping's view, he became bigger than the party. Where all this came to a head was a number of years ago at what's called the Bund conference in Shanghai, which is an annual conference. Jack decided to publicly attack the party's financial management policies and how constricting it was on new forms of innovation in the Chinese financial services sector, where Ant Financial, one of Jack's subsidiaries, would be a major participant. Xi Jinping just cracked right down. And not just on him, but what was then called the collectivity of the platform companies. And that included others, including Tencent and a number of other firms. And then there began a series of, quote, anti-monopoly or antitrust moves against the size which these companies had reached. And then that spilt over into a broader campaign against, shall we say, the excessive display of private wealth, private influence, ostentation, and the private sector writ large. And that led to a further campaign to implant party secretaries in each of these private firms, and to say to these private firms, by the way, we think it's a good idea under a mixed economy model that the state begins to take equity in your companies. So needless to say, this didn't lead to a set of happy campers amongst the Chinese private sector. And as a result of that, you began to see not only this trend that I referred to before, which is static or declining figures for private domestic consumption, consumers driving the future of growth, but private fixed capital investment also began to slide as well. Both these things created a dilemma for the party's overall growth discipline. You correctly said before, the unofficial social contract used to be 8% growth, and then became 6% growth. Hey, 4 would be okay, but it was beginning to slide south of that. So they've tried to stabilize both these things since about 2024. You may remember this high-level meeting in early 25 when Jack was finally brought in from the cold together with other...
He'd sort of been disappeared for a while.
Yeah, he'd...
You didn't see him anymore.
Yeah, he'd been actively studying texts, and I'm sure that included Xi Jinping thought. I'm not quite sure. But, he wasn't arrested, but he was not exactly completely free to move either. So there's been an effort to bring these folks back into the circle, and also because even under Xi Jinping's industrial policy, with cutting-edge new technologies led by artificial intelligence being at the fore, and Xi Jinping realizes that, guess what, state-owned enterprises can't do all of this. In fact, most of the juice lies within the Chinese private sector. We'd better re-embrace them. So there's been an attempt to correct, but we should not lose sight of the fact that the fundamental, shall I say, move to the Marxist left, move to industrial policy, über alles, move to the China controlling global supply chains, national party state view of the world is still predominant. It is. These other two corrections for consumers and for private entrepreneurs have been more at the margins.
Well, let me speak from what I think to be the American perception of China and how it's changed in this, let's call it 5-year period, right, since post-COVID. And there was a period when Jack Ma was suddenly gone, and you could see Xi cracking down on a bunch of these companies where, many people in the US, I think, had the view, and zero COVID was considered to have gone on way too long and been something of a disaster, that we were finally seeing the thing that had been long predicted, which is countries with that strong of a centralized government, call it authoritarian, call it communist, however you want to frame it, that eventually they begin to break because the leader can make bad decisions, and eventually will. Paranoid decisions, power consolidating decisions, and that you saw China's growth rate going down, and that maybe this period of Chinese rise was coming to an end. This was very much as the Biden people left office, how they felt things were. And then I would say over the last 2 years, that shifted again. This is my perception of the zeitgeist, to a sense now that China's industrial juggernaut has jumped a series of levels such that it is no longer just copying America, but it can now do things America, to say nothing of the Europeans or others, cannot do. It is nearly level with us in AI. but much more able to build some of the underlying infrastructure of AI, like energy. But its ability to produce electric vehicles, its ability to produce functionally anything because of its manufacturing ecosystems is now actually beyond where we are. And so it was wrong, this sense a few years ago, that the Chinese model is beginning to break down. And in fact, whatever its problems, it has developed perhaps not economic prosperity, but economic power that is very, very real. In some ways, all of these stories seem true to me. And I'm curious how you think about that kind of whiplash that has been happening in the American story of the Chinese economy and its power.
Well, I think, Ezra, you're right to describe that evolution of American perceptions. And American perceptions are not entirely detached from the underpinning Chinese economic reality. Sometimes I worry, though, in this country, where I've lived among you now for the better part of 10 years, sometimes hope becomes a substitute for analysis and strategy in this country, that Americans, or at least those in administrations of one hue or another, look at Chinese demography. They look at the slowing of growth and they say, yeah, we told you so, problem fixed, and we move on. It ain't fixed. China is formidable, and particularly under a leader like Xi Jinping, it's doubly formidable. And given his surveillance apparatus, it's trebly formidable. I think in terms of the periods you're talking about, yes, post-COVID, growth slowed. But underpinning it all was always this continued red thread of Xi Jinping's core organizing principle, which is, I'm building the world's most powerful industrial state, and I'm not going to let any bunch of private entrepreneurs or consumers get in the road of that. I'm just going to do it. That was Made in China 2025. The 10 technology objectives he set for himself in 2015. If you look at the double down in the current 15th five-year plan announced in only...
These are technologies like semiconductors,
yeah,
EVs.
Aeronautics, EVs, batteries. If you look at the list of where they were in 2015, which was nowhere much, and where they were by 2025 at the end of last year, frankly, as an exercise in industrial policy alone, whatever the economic inefficiency may have been in getting there, Xi Jinping regards that as a bit of loose change compared with obtaining the commanding heights of these new driving technologies.
America is keeping Chinese electric vehicles out, not because they're bad cars. It's because they're such good cars. And if they came in here at their cost, they would annihilate the American electric vehicle sector, right? I think this is a change that people have not, for so long our theory was they're copying us or stealing our intellectual property. Now we are quite afraid in some cases of their intellectual property.
I think this has been a big evolution in the reality. Does China engage in industrial espionage? Yes. Does China copy stuff which is obviously available through open patent? Of course. And they have the great advantage of scale, and they scale up. They scale up rapidly given the automatic leverage of their domestic market. But given their domestic market is still flat because of problems with disposable income, then deploying this surplus capacity, this surplus production on global markets is their next best step. And since America has erected the tariff wall, all roads lead to Europe, which is why you see such huge reaction now from European political leaders. That's what's unfolding. And it's all of those things everywhere at once. And at a pace of knots, like this thing is happening at speed now. Is it sustainable for China itself? Ultimately, there is a problem of finance. And we need to think this through. How does China finance this level of industrial subsidy? For them in their calculus, this is a temporary exercise. That is, we will, through our level of industrial subsidy, ultimately destroy the world's competition and opposition. Those will fold. Then we can restore prices at a level which makes sense for us in terms of the cost of production domestically. But by then, the alternative sources of production have gone. This is a very elaborately thought-through strategy on the part of the Chinese. And so far, to give them credit, it has worked remarkably well. But they cannot sustain it indefinitely. They're currently borrowing from Chinese consumers and their personal savings in banks to keep this whole thing afloat. But industrial subsidy, which is of an order of magnitude not seen in economic history before, cannot be sustained forever.
So I want to slow this part down because I think it's really important. You were saying earlier, you described the problem, right? The Americans just sort of hope the problem is solved. And what is the problem? How does one define the problem? And we're not always very clear about that. But I think it's something quite close to this, that the challenge China poses to the rest of the world is it is able to suppress domestic prosperity, take money from its own people, keep their wages down, in order to put it into these industries to attain scale, which would functionally make it impossible for other countries to compete in these industries because they will just be too far behind and the Chinese goods will be too much cheaper. I mean, that is the theory in part of the tariffs you saw come out in the Biden administration, and obviously even more in the Trump administration, which is if China is going to make its products artificially cheap, we are going to make them artificially expensive. From that perspective, is that a wise strategy?
It is a perfectly logical response to the challenge which China's industrial policy, which exists on the basis of massive industrial subsidies, poses. The alternative is you simply allow the Chinese industrial juggernaut to dominate every single industrial and sub-industrial sector. We've already seen that in terms of critical minerals and rare earths, both raw and processed. If you want a case study of what that looks like in practice, look at that sector.
Not only did they dominate that, they were so dominant in it that they were able to break Trump's tariff policy, break his trade war by simply threatening to remove our access to their rare earths and magnets and so on. They had leverage over us that we did not have over them.
The Chinese are highly intelligent, highly disciplined, masters of economic statecraft, and they know where leverage lies. And because their political culture is dominated by a culture of engineers, they understand precisely, instinctively, before you get an elaborate dumbed-down briefing to your average Western cabinet about where they stand against the periodic table of critical minerals and rare earths, how many they've got, both on the extraction side and the processing side, and where they therefore will end up to by year X in their ability to, shall we say, exercise leverage elsewhere.
So I think I want to flip the question of what Xi Jinping believes for a minute. We've been talking about what he believes about China. What does he believe about the United States of America and about Donald Trump?
He hasn't told me. So again, we're into the realm of speculation here. But his view of America, let me start with that, and then we'll move on to the president. His view of America is that it's the only country in the world potentially standing in the way of his national, political and economic and geopolitical ambition. Why? Simply because of your scale. And secondly, for 100 years, you guys have represented, since the early days of Dewey liberalism, an alternative script for how you construct the politics of a country. And so when Xi Jinping looks at America, he looks at it through these two lenses. You represent this massive alternative ideational force, the attraction to the idea that still causes many successful Chinese to go and live in the United States and the rest of the collective West, because freedom is not a hackneyed phrase, particularly if you've lived in a country where there is none. But at the level of raw national power, the power of the US military, the power of Indo-Pacific Command, the power of what you have in cyber and space and your nuclear forces, and the power of American innovation reflected through Silicon Valley cubed, he looks at that and says, that's the only thing that can get in my road. And that's why America occupies this unique position, whether you're run by Republicans or whether you're run by Democrats.
We've talked about how Xi Jinping has a dialectical, historical view of China's rise and communism's rise. Does that extend to a similarly inevitabilist view of American decline. Does the Chinese Communist Party, does its sort of mainstream of thought believe America to be in a kind of structural decline?
They do have this belief, and it's expressed in two different ways. There is a Chinese concept of what they call comprehensive national power. It's a standard analytical framework for aggregate American power v. aggregate Chinese power against all indices of power. They look at the size of the US military, the size of allied militaries, the size of their own military, and they make their own calculus. They also make calculus about the solidity of, shall we say, US alliances abroad, and when those are under pressure or when they're beginning to fracture. They also look at the solidity of the US domestic body politic and the degree of unity and disunity against, shall we say, the predetermined unity of the Chinese unitary state. Interestingly, they stopped publishing this stuff for the rest of the world to see what their conclusions were about 12 years ago, I think because the results were beginning to look increasingly indicative that China was really rising rather rapidly. The second is in a propagandistic phrase, which is in Chinese, it's Dongsheng Xijiang, which is the rise of the East and the decline of the West. And in Chinese political parlance, that's a euphemism for China and the United States. And if there's a third phrase, it's probably Xi Jinping's oft-used phrase, including during the summit with President Trump most recently. The world is now experiencing changes not seen in 100 years. He first began using that phrase in 2017 on the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. And the internal interpretation of the phrase is that we, the Chinese, now with our own revolution, now going out into the world at large, represent as seminal shaking an event of the certainties and certitudes of global politics today as the Bolshevik Revolution portended back in 1917.
And so then there's, I guess, two things here. One is that in the time Xi Jinping has been leader, American policy towards China, American political elite thinking towards China has changed dramatically. It's become far more antagonistic. The sense that China would become more liberal and democratic as it became richer has dissolved. The sense that we allowed China to take advantage of us has become a bipartisan theory, and that we are locked in a great competition with him. Possibly a Thucydides trap leading to war has become fairly widely believed and certainly widely prepared for. And of course, American politics itself has changed, falling into this period of Trumpism and much more internal division. I mean, you read a book called The Avoidable War that was at least partly about this.
Yeah.
What is their narrative of us in this era?
They saw a sea change just under 10 years ago, and during the first Trump administration, when the official American strategy towards China changed from strategic engagement to strategic competition. H.R. McMaster, then Trump's national security advisor, wrote that in the national security strategy, I think, December of 2017. And that wasn't just a piece of language. You could almost hear the creaking of the entire machinery of the US state across all agencies of power.
Yeah, before that, Obama talked about his pivot to Asia.
That's true. But he did not have an organizing principle, which is that we are in a competitive relationship with China about which country becomes the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific and in the world. So that's the big change. That dominated second half of Trump's term, the first term, dominated really Biden administration, and then through until the most recently convened summit in Beijing, where we now have a different organizing principle announced for the first time, this time by the Chinese, called constructive strategic stability. And the White House briefing paper, which came back at the conclusion of the visit, said, yeah, that's the framework we accept so long as it's fair and reciprocal. So what does that mean if you decode it? I think what the Chinese are seeking to do is to cause the United States to be more stable, less unpredictable, and less antagonistic going forward. What is it going to mean in practice? I don't know. One of the advantages may be the two sides begin to have an active and substantive negotiation on the regulation of the most dangerous and destabilizing forms of artificial intelligence, which is what came out of Scott Bessent's conversations with his counterpart, He Lifeng. For the rest of the relationship beyond AI governance, I'm not sure yet.
I find policy towards China, the U.S. orientation to China, to be one of maybe the most major area of U.S. policy where my own thoughts are most unsettled. There's one story that I think has become a more popular story, and I think you could extract it out of at least part of our conversation, which is to say Xi Jinping and the CCP under him are highly ideological organizations and individuals bent on eventually attaining Chinese supremacy, particularly economically and industrially. And you need to understand the relationship as having a competition and an antagonism at its heart. You can manage that better and worse. You can manage it more erratically or more systematically. Right? The Biden administration, I think, was trying to do it very systematically, build up American industries, impose very targeted tariffs, boundary certain kinds of technologies. The Trump administration, I think, has managed it more erratically. But fundamentally, openness towards China in this telling is very dangerous. You don't want their technologies here. You don't want their industries with too much penetration here. And you are trying to compete with them, not learn from them. It's another argument that, in partly for me, I get nervous whenever anything becomes too bipartisan in Washington that says, this is a mistake. You actually need to learn right now from things like Chinese EV manufacturers. You want technology exchanges. You want to understand their manufacturing systems. You don't want to make antagonism self-fulfilling. You don't want to create a lot of room for misinterpretation. There are advantages economically and otherwise that the openness creates. That the shift towards seeing it as fundamentally opposed is actually missing a lot of positive some opportunities in trade, innovation. If China, they have a lot of actually really interesting bio research coming out. If they invent new medications, that's wonderful for us. Where do you fall on this spectrum?
The third way. And let me explain what I mean by that. One, as I've said before, don't mistake the fundamentals here, which is that Xi Jinping and the party he leads is Leninist. And they have a very clear-eyed view of where they wish to be at home and abroad. And at home and abroad, it's for China to become a fully developed economy, and abroad for China to be the most powerful state in the Indo-Pacific region and in the world, and to surpass the United States. So let's just be clear about that. It's an unemotional, clear-headed, realist, but ideologically driven view of the world. What I've argued for a long period of time, and I think there are levels of agreement and disagreement with this approach, is what I call managed strategic competition. Accept the reality of the competition and manage it. It's far better than unmanaged strategic competition, which can end in crisis, conflict, and war. What do I mean by that? 3 points, really. Accept the fact that there are fundamental strategic red lines which they can't cross and we can't cross, and that managing those red lines, particularly over the question of Taiwan, the South China Sea and the East China Sea, is the meat and potatoes of sustained deterrence, and that actually creates the strategic stability for the rest of the management of the relationship to ensue. The second element of managed strategic competition is, for the economy writ large, whether it's trade, investment, capital markets, currency markets, technology markets, talent markets, ideas markets, the ideation of the future, the liberal international rules-based order or one headquartered in Beijing, make this a full and open competition and may the best system win. The third component of managed strategic competition is those areas which we define as in our mutual interest to cooperate on. Future of AI governance, ? Preventing the next global pandemic, given how much we all screwed up on the last one, particularly the Chinese. The future of other forms of global public health, like cancer research and biotech. And these are quite rich areas for collaboration. And my view is we can walk and chew gum at the same time in these three different domains while recognizing that we're not ultimately engaged with those organizing a Sunday school picnic.
Well, that brings up, I think, Taiwan, which is something we should talk at least a little bit about before we end. What I hear in your strategic managed competition framework is a orientation towards clarity, right? Where do we compete? Where do we cooperate? Taiwan, the fundamental nature of that is ambiguity. America has a studied, ambiguous description of what Taiwan is and what is going on with it, and even what our policy towards it may be. We don't really know we know what Xi Jinping wants, which is ultimately unification and control of Taiwan, but we don't know what he will do to get it or when. That's the one where I hear the most constant concern, because neither side, I think, really understands the other. So I guess, how do you think about where the Chinese are on Taiwan? And then how do you think about the overall framework for managing that strategic competition appropriately?
Now, Ezra, this is a really important element of our overall conversation, because it's the most time relevant in terms of problems which could arise before you and I look much grayer. I look much grayer than you, by the way. My hair turned white because of the global financial crisis. So I was in office at the time. It might fall out if we have a Taiwan crisis.
Sure.
So where's Chinese thinking up to on Taiwan? Xi Jinping has made it clear that he wants Taiwanese reunification with Taiwan before the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic, and that's in 2049. That sounds like an eternity away. It's now 23 years away. So that's not exactly an eternity. Secondly, his policy towards Taiwan is increasingly hard and sharp.
Give me an example of what you mean by that. What is he actually saying?
He is saying that on the question of Taiwan and his most recent engagements with President Trump in Beijing, that unless this is handled prudently, this is a very dangerous issue which could result in collision and conflict. He hasn't used those formulations before. So these are not just, I'm shooting the breeze with my best pal Don, and this is what I felt like this morning after I'd had my waffle.
And he's not like Trump. He speaks very carefully.
Yeah, because he's a Leninist, and, words are bullets for these guys, and they often result in bullets. And then thirdly, what do we see? Increasingly the patterns of Chinese military exercises in relation to the Taiwan Straits move from just being, shall we say, abstract exercises of China's military preparedness against, for example, a Taiwanese unilateral declaration of independence, which is, I think, a 0.0% possibility, to exercises which increasingly resemble rehearsals for either taking a Taiwanese offshore island, imposing a blockade, or a full-scale invasion of the island.
We have satellite imagery of very precise replicas of various Taiwanese buildings for military exercises?
Well, because I'm still, shall I say, subject to various national security requirements given my most recent job, you can speculate on that. I couldn't possibly comment.
I'm just saying we've come across reporting on that.
That's good. I'm glad that you've so reflected. Anyway, we've moved from abstraction to reality. We've moved from ahistoric time to historic time. In Xi's calculus, he's now 73 years old. He's up for reappointment at the end of next year. He probably has a couple of terms in him yet, but he's also, as a good Marxist-Leninist, looking to where the dialectical forces take him in terms of unique periods of opportunity. Does he perceive 2028 as a unique period of opportunity? I don't know, but I do notice a sharpening in his levels of preparedness.
Something you said at the beginning of this conversation is his view is that you want China unified and its enemies divided. And say what you will about Trump, whatever you believe about him, this is, and he is, divisive time and force in American life. 2028 is going to be a presidential election year. there is going to be not a lot of appetite among the American people for foreign adventurism, particularly after the Iran War proved something of a disaster. There's not a high level of commitment to Taiwan in America. It's not a place we think about. And I'm not saying that Xi Jinping is going to choose to invade Taiwan at that moment, but he and the Chinese Communist Party see America as in a kind of political and even terminal decline, your historical materialism. And so I wonder how he sees this, and this is a sort of moment of opportunity.
Yeah, I'm worried very much that Xi Jinping could miscalculate in 2028. Why do I say 2028, by the way, and not 2027 or 2026, is that the Taiwanese have their own presidential elections in January of 28. And if the existing Democratic Progress Party, which is anathema to Xi Jinping, gets re-elected, it'll be for its fourth term, and it has run consistently on a, shall we say, independence-leaning platform. Will they get re-elected in January 28? I don't know, but I think it's a 50-50 possibility. Does this therefore become a trigger for Xi Jinping to say enough is enough? Open question, given he would just been reappointed as General Secretary of the party the previous October, November. And he's aware that 2028 is a presidential election year here in the United States. What do I fear? A miscalculation by Xi Jinping about the level of American resolve. Do they, the Chinese, conclude post-Iran, for example, that the likelihood of any American leadership to deploy forces in the event of a Taiwan crisis would be reduced as a result of the Iran experience? And then there's the more mechanical question of the extent to which the American arsenal depth, magazine depth, capability set has been impaired as a result of Iran. So my concern as an analyst is, could he arrive at a conclusion through a bout of excessive self-confidence that a unique opportunity has arisen? The danger is that he actually miscalculates. To act against Taiwan would be to cause President Trump to look weak. And the one thing I've observed about President Trump in the last several years I've been in Washington, the last thing President Trump likes is to look weak. So I think we are in potentially dangerous territory.
One question that I hear from Americans is, well, why should we care about Taiwan? Why is this our problem? When you say, what if they miscalculate American political will? They might calculate it correctly. There is an American elite commitment to Taiwan. Do swing voters in Ohio care about Taiwan? Does the American public in general care about Taiwan? And so what is your actual answer to that? Why is the answer to Taiwan being a flashpoint actually to say maybe it shouldn't be? Maybe it's not America's problem.
I think the reason why you've had such buy-in to deterrence over Taiwan is not because of some, feel-good American emotional commitment to those nice folks over there. It's actually much more hard-headed than you would give credit to. Number one, it was the Congress that framed the Taiwan Relations Act back in 1979 at the time of diplomatic recognition of the mainland, and which is a de facto form of security guarantee for the Taiwanese. And that's an act of your Congress. And therefore, if you go to the congressional leadership, Democrat and Republican, they have seen themselves as the long-term custodians of that set of arrangements. But the second is this. Let's hypothetically assume, Ezra, that Xi Jinping walks into Taiwan tomorrow, decapitates the leadership, it's gone, it's now become China's province, fully fledged, red flag goes up over the presidential building in downtown Taipei, and the first party secretary arrives, to take over the administration of the province, and the suppression of the locals having been much bloodshed in the process. I think at that point, what Americans need to consider is what happens to the rest of the world's perception and conclusion about US strategic reliability worldwide at that point, it becomes very much the point at which the notion of Pax Americana disappears in the collective consciousness of allies around the world. The Japanese, for example, may then conclude it's a time for them to go nuclear. If they go nuclear, the Koreans will conclude, well, if the Japanese are going nuclear, we'll be going nuclear. In other words, the whole dynamic of this region changes. And the third thing for Americans to consider is it the conclusion here in the United States that China, already having assembled the world's largest surface fleet, for example, having taken Taiwan, that it's time then to deliver to the Chinese people a grand peace dividend? We will then reduce the size of the Chinese military by 2/3 because we've achieved our historical mission, and we'll all therefore have better social security payments as a result. Unlikely, because Xi Jinping's made plain that China's power projection should be pan-regional, beyond the Taiwan Straits, and because of existing behaviours, increasingly global. And then I think there's this final point, which is, if you guys still see yourselves as the light on the hill, if you do, are you indifferent to places which have, of their own volition, evolved into democracies and to open societies and to open economies around the world, like the 23 million people on Taiwan? And if you're indifferent to that, what does it say about your indifference to freedom worldwide? I think those are active considerations for the American body politic. But as a barbarian living in your midst, far be it from me to tell you what's right or wrong.
And so then what is a wise policy behind those considerations?
The wise policy is, in fact, the least expensive and most effective: sustained deterrence. If you sustain deterrence, and we therefore sustain the status quo across the Taiwan Straits, as Deng Xiaoping once said, we kick the ball down the road for future generations who will be much wiser than us to resolve this intractable problem.
I think that is a good place to end. Always our final question. What are 3 books you'd recommend to the audience?
Because we've been talking a little bit about China today, you'll be pleased to know, Ezra, I'm not recommending a text on dialectical materialism. But one I thought may be of interest, given your line of questioning, and perhaps those who are listening, is, so where did Xi Jinping come from? So there's a great book by Joseph Terigian, The Party's Interests Come First, The Life of Xi Jinping, father of Xi Jinping. It's a great book and a great read. The second is Ian Johnson, The Souls of China, The Return of Religion After Mao. And it's about what has occurred on the grounds, in the grassroots, with the rise of various forms of Taoism, Buddhism, Protestant Christianity, and other forms of religious belief as a reaction to the uber-materialism of, let's call it, China's ideological orthodoxy. And that is a great read. The third one's by another American author, Pope Leo XIV, and or as we would call him in Australia, Pope Bob I, a guy from Chicago. And the encyclical on artificial intelligence, which I've been working my way through, it's a great read about the essential dignity of the human person and how AI uplifts that dignity or how it may impair that dignity.
Kevin Rudd, thank you very much.
Good to be with you, Ezra.